Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Just letting everybody come into the room here, virtual room. Seeing those numbers continue to go up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this conversation this morning or afternoon if you're joining us from a different time zone. So glad you could make the time for this. I am joining you from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory in what's colonially known as Vancouver on a gray and windy day, a typical spring day as we go through this seasonal transition. I know we have folks joining us from many different traditional unceded or treaty lands from far and wide. So recognizing the important basis that provides us for these conversations that we are visitors on these lands. A couple of things before we get any further along. As you can see, ASL interpretation is available, and thank you so much to Jess, who's on your screen, and John, who will be joining us later, both of whom are doing our ASL interpretation. If you have any issues, please let our team know in the chat if you're having trouble viewing anybody. I am just seeing that there is a message for me. Sounds like there might be some issues in terms of sound, so I hope most of you can still hear me. Folks from our team is a good segue to the next housekeeping bit, which is our team is available via the webinar chat. So the chat function at the bottom of our screen, if you have any technical issues, please ping them in the chat and they're there to assist you. Webinar participants can't speak to each other in case you're not really familiar with this particular format on Zoom. And but you can talk to our team. So if there's any issues there, and they'll pass on any messages to me. We're also recording the session today, so we can post it on our website as an ongoing resource available for folks to engage with in hindsight if they want to watch it later. So as you know, we're here today to have what I anticipate to be a lively conversation on human rights issues facing migrant workers. The goal is to have a conversation with, the goal of our Behind the Headlines series is to have conversations with leaders and change makers about key issues facing British Columbians or people in BC. In August of last year, we released a report called Our Rights in Focus, which surveys the landscape of human rights in the province to raise awareness about human rights issues and leverage this knowledge to create change. Today's event is the second in a series that is highlighting the different topics around the 10 key systems that we discussed in that report. Today, we are focused on migrant workers' rights, which we spotlighted in our research into inequities in the workplace in that Rights in Focus report. We focused on the world of employment and inequities there, but we really delved more deeply into the rights of temporary foreign workers. Before I go any further into delving into our topic today, though, I want to introduce my guest for today's conversation. Ketty Nivyabandi, practiced that, and now I still stuttered over it. My apologies, Ketty. Serves as Secretary General for Amnesty International Canada's English-speaking section. She oversees the domestic and international human rights mandate of the organization and acts as its lead representative. A global human rights activist and advocate, Ketty holds in-depth expertise and lived experience in forced displacement, human rights defenders at risk, civic space in conflict and political transitions, and the global intersections of gender, race, and human rights. Prior to seeking asylum in Canada in 2015, she was the lead organizer of women's peaceful protests for democratic change in her home country of Burundi. In her previous roles, Ketty has led research, advocacy, and communication strategies with women peace activists in several conflict and post-conflict countries, including Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Myanmar, Uganda, and Guatemala. Ketty studied international relations is a former journalist and a published poet. She lives in Ottawa with her 2 teenage daughters. I've heard her describe how her identities as an artist, an activist, a poet, a woman, and a refugee coexist and live simultaneously within her, and I know she brings all those experiences to her talk with us here today. Welcome, Ketty. Is there anything you'd like to say by way of introduction?
Thank you so much, Kasari. It's wonderful to be here with you. I'm joining you from the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory where our offices are headquartered, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you. The discussion today will be shaped by what we've heard from migrant workers and advocates in the sector through our own research and through our engagement. The important work that, as well as the important work that Amnesty International has done through their recent report, Canada Has Destroyed Me, Labor Exploitation of Migrant Workers in Canada. We want to know your questions as well. And we know many in the audience bring their own experiences as migrant workers and advocates to this conversation. So we want to hear your expertise. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A function. So the Q&A at the bottom of the webinar screen and on the Zoom platform. Please feel free to drop your questions in there as we go so that you don't forget them, so that we have them when it's time. If we're able to answer things as we go, we will. But I'm keeping my eye on all the different pop-ups here on my screen. If we don't, we will try to get to it at the end. And certainly we look forward to having more of that conversation after we've done some chatting between Ketty and I. As I mentioned, folks will be on our team on the chat, posting links and any tech issues, and please feel free to reach out to them. Okay, so let's jump in to this conversation. First, I want to spend a few minutes setting the stage. Canada's Temporary Foreign Workers Program was created in 1973 to allow and regulate employers to bring foreign workers to Canada on a temporary basis. The program has changed and shifted over the years, but one piece has remained constant, which is the existence of closed or tied work permits, tying a worker to a specific employer, which embeds vulnerability and risk of exploitation. Under this program, many people are working as caregivers and as agricultural workers, among a number of other jobs, work that is essential to the Canadian economy and to our communities, but often goes unseen by the majority of Canadians. There are also a number of other programs which tie together employment and immigration policies or otherwise regulate people coming from other countries to work and live here in Canada. So, Ketty, with that very brief context to the legal regime, can you walk us through how the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, TFWP for short, came to exist as a central labor and migration policy across the country? And what are some of the key differences between this program and other programs dealing with work and immigration?
Yes, Kasari, and I like that we're starting there because it's important to see this program as part of a long history of immigration policies and systems that the Canada has had in place for well over a century, right? So as you rightly said, the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, which we'll talk about at length today, started in 1973. However, until the 1960s, Canada had an immigration system that was primarily targeted at bringing in folks from a very specific demographic, and that is attracting people from Europe and the Western world in general, really favoring white immigration for permanent stay in Canada. People who were keen to, to white British sort of lifestyle, and occasionally bringing in racialized people on a very temporary basis to fill in some very specific labor gaps. And here we're thinking about the Canada Pacific Railway, for instance, where Chinese workers were, unable to come, but on very defined terms. So until the 60s, the immigration policies were explicitly, when you look at the data, when you look at the people who came into the country, very clearly divided along racial and class lines. In the 1960s, a range of reforms were put in place, and you start seeing what's called the immigration point system in 1967. But right before that, in 1966, was the introduction of the seasonal agricultural worker program, which is now part of the temporary foreign workers program. And that's when you see, for the first time, a group of Jamaican male workers, about 267 of them, coming to Ontario specifically to work on agricultural projects. And that is really the genesis of the temporary foreign worker program that will then be really established in 1973 as a last and limited resort to allow employers to bring foreign workers to Canada on a temporary basis to fill jobs for which qualified Canadians are not available. So that was the genesis at the time. But it is important to highlight that already at that time, there were questions and there was awareness within the Canadian federal government that this program was inherently unjust and unfair. And I want to quote a line which is in our report from the then Minister of Immigration, Honorable Jean Marchand, back in June 1966. He was Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, and he said, and I quote, "Now, we were asked to try and establish a special class for people intending to go into agriculture. The only way is to bind them by their fare. In other words, to promise to pay their fare provided they work on a farm for 1, 2, or 3 years. But in my opinion, this is not a very sound procedure in a democracy. I think this is slave labor rather than freedom." This was from his speech at the Canadian House of Commons on June 3rd, 1966. And it is this program that later has evolved and been reshaped over the years to become what we are now considering and discussing as the temporary foreign workers program. That historical background is really important. And despite the fact that these race and class considerations were eliminated in the 60s, the behavior, the treatment, and the biases did not disappear overnight either, right? And so you start seeing the development of temporary labor migration programs with what's called an international mobility program, which is really designed, it's a high-skill program designed to advance Canada's broad economic and cultural national interest, which has it has an open or tight permit, but really is attracting people in fields that are really needed for high-wage jobs, and then a low-skill scheme, which is the temporary foreign workers program, which is designed to fill a labor shortage again in the Canadian economy.
That quote from the Justice Minister reminded me of another quote I've got in here somewhere from the Special Rapporteur on forms of torture, I believe, and on contemporary forms of torture. And they called the Canadian Temporary Foreign Workers Program a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. Do you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. And so this was made, this is from his report issued in 2024, last year, following a visit that he made to Canada the year before in 2023, and in which we supported and helped facilitate meetings with migrant workers and so on and so forth. So yes, and his report is a must read. He does conclude, indeed, that the migrant worker program is a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, Why? Because of the tied nature of the visa, which creates an asymmetry of power between the employer and the employee. And we can go more in depth into that.
Yeah, thank you. I don't, maybe you've covered this off already with everything you've said so far, but what do you think that most folks in Canada don't know or understand about migrant and labor policies here? And what do you think it's important for them to know?
Well, first, I think most Canadians, when they are going to the grocery store and picking up their strawberries for their, morning smoothie, for instance, as I did today, do not necessarily connect that with the people whose labor makes that possible. So they do not, and you see things like when here you will pick strawberries grown in Ontario versus those probably grown in the United States, and you'll think you've made a good ethical choice and you're promoting the Canadian workers, not realizing that these strawberries were likely, planted and cared for by people who were exploited, whose labor was very cheap, often underpaid in the most difficult and traumatic working conditions. So I think there's a genuine lack of awareness about migrant workers because they are invisible by design.
Yeah.
So that is the first thing. I think the second thing is the myth that is often perpetuated in public narratives that, immigrants and migrant workers, and we tend to put all these people in the same, basket, right? So you're a refugee, an asylum seeker, you're an international student, you're a migrant worker, you're an immigrant. All of these people are lumped into this group called immigrants, who are coming in large numbers and who are taking over, the jobs of many Canadians, and who are also making social services unavailable for other Canadians, who are making housing increasingly difficult, and so on and so forth. And so there's very little understanding that the specific category of migrant workers who are often working in remote areas in the most inadequate housing conditions, and were brought here and often are in shock about the working conditions that they experience here, are completely deprived of their rights. Right. In fact, the public perception is the opposite, right? That people are leaving their countries, their conflict-ridden countries, to come and take over the opportunities available in Canada, when in fact, most of the migrant workers we heard from told us that the living conditions they experienced in Canada were those they had never experienced before in their lives. Some told us, I did not come here to become a slave, and I was treated like a slave in Canada. I think these are things that generally Canadians are not aware of, and it is our role and duty to ensure that they know what's happening, because I believe that if they were, they will demand better from public officials.
Well, it's a great segue to this small video that we put together with Dignidad Migrante, who is an organization that works directly with migrant workers, and they share the story of a migrant worker experience here in British Columbia. And I want to take a moment to play this video to kind of ground our big policy conversation in exactly those lived experiences that we're referring to. I think our team will come on and help us all see that video.
En el verano del 2024, la Oficina de la Comisada de los Derechos Humanos de BC publicó su primer reporte sobre asuntos claves de la provincia. Como parte de la sección de empleo, realzamos algunas de las experiencias de los trabajadores migrantes. En este video, la organización comunitaria con sede en Chilliwack, Dignidad Migrante, nos ofrece una visión más detallada.
La lista, para explicarles a ustedes la lista de violaciones a los derechos humanos de los trabajadores migrantes, es enorme, es casi infinita, podríamos decir. Pero voy a hablar de algunas que son como las más evidentes y las más claras. Mi nombre es Raúl Gatica. Yo soy miembro de la Dignidad Migrante Society. Dignidad Migrante Society es una organización de trabajadores migrantes. La organización está formada, dirigida y operada por los propios trabajadores migrantes. En el 2021, cuando las inundaciones pasaron, afectando prácticamente una parte de Chilliwack y una parte de Abbotsford, nosotros recibimos pues llamadas de muchos de nuestros compañeros trabajadores migrantes que trabajan en las granjas, que estaban ahí abandonados, que no sabían dónde ir, que los patrones se habían ido. Y fue muy interesante ver cómo los empleadores, en cuanto supieron que estábamos ahí, empezaron a esconder a los trabajadores. Y empezaban a esconder a los trabajadores, los movían de un lugar a otro, para que no los habláramos, para que no los contactáramos, para que no les explicáramos de sus derechos. Yo puedo decir que el cambio climático ha afectado a los trabajadores, digamos, de 4 maneras básicas. La primera es que cuando son desplazados de sus países por el cambio climático y los obliga a dejar de trabajar sus tierras y venirse a trabajar a otro país. Segundo, cuando llegan a estos países y encuentran que por el cambio climático, inundaciones o calor muy fuerte, pierden su trabajo. Tercero, que al perder su trabajo no hay mecanismos, no hay establecidas reglas que garanticen algún apoyo para los trabajadores que son afectados por esas emergencias o por esos temas. Y cuarto, que los trabajadores reciben represión en estas situaciones de emergencia en lugar de recibir apoyo, que reciben maltrato, amenazas en lugar de recibir ayuda. Creo que la primera gran tarea que tienen que hacer los canadienses es mirarnos, es reconocer que existimos. No solo llamarnos héroes, no solo llamarnos esenciales, sino luchar porque tengamos derechos, que nos acompañen en nuestras luchas por obtener derechos. Eso es lo principal.
Thank you so much to Raul and those who are willing to be featured and share their stories there. And one of the things that has been an important learning and that Raul talked about in this in the video was the role of climate change. And I think climate change has both a role in motivating folks to enroll in the temporary foreign workers program and also impacts their experiences while they're here. Ketty, can you tell us more about what you learned through the writing of the report related to these issues, or just sort of in general, what role climate change does have in the issues we're talking about here today?
Yes, and what a compelling video, right? And how articulate Raul is in really talking about those 4 main ways in which they're affected. Let me talk about the first 2, because the last 2 are more lack of protection systems, which we can talk about. Our report did not necessarily focus on the impact of climate change on migrant workers, but a lot of our work generally is focused on climate change and climate justice. And what we know is that the displacement of people because of climate change is only growing and is likely to continue growing in the years to come. What people don't necessarily know is the extent to which a country like Canada may be responsible for that climate disruption overseas. So for instance, Canada caps its emissions in the country, in Canada, but does not count the emissions that it has overseas. So we are actually not even capturing adequately the impact that our industries have on the rest of the world. And I can talk about the extractive industries, for instance, where Canada has the largest mining footprint around the world, and particularly in Africa and Latin America, the countries from which the majority of migrant workers come from. And there we see a lot of mining projects, extractive projects, which are being carried out without any environmental assessment, against the will of the local population, which is often indigenous, and which are disrupting the local ecosystems. And so that often results in the displacement of that population into another area, and often drives people to seek, any other means of survival, which includes, obviously becoming a migrant worker. You tie that to the fact that there are often third-party recruiters who are aggressively, trying to recruit people, offering them, dangling, these very promising jobs overseas. And of course, people are going to take those because they're desperately trying to survive as their own environment, their own economies, and own agriculture is disrupted by climate change. So that's an aspect that's really important. And then the second piece he was talking about is the extent to which once they are here, obviously climate change disrupts farms across the country, and then they are left without any, without any support. If for any reason, any emergency, they have to stop their work, they are left again, without any form of institutional support.
It does raise that larger question too of what, the world right now is rapidly changing around us, and the political situation along with all the climate issues that we've just been talking about. How does that picture of global pressures impact changes to who's coming and what experiences they're bringing with them beyond climate, like the other sort of global forces impacting migration in the world?
Well, hugely, particularly right now, and especially south of the border, which is impacting also how we respond in Canada. We're seeing Canada become tougher on the border as a result of the pressure it is under from the United States. And we're seeing the United States deport, thousands of individuals on a regular basis. Some of them are migrant workers, but also cutting any form of support to other countries which were dependent on this and who are now, whose populations are now left in limbo and are looking for ways to survive. So it's a complete disruption of the global migration system. On one hand, having countries who are the number one emitters of, of climate change, of arms, of extraction, around the world are the same countries that are, setting up these steel barriers at their borders. And again, sort of refusing the people who have been disrupted by these, by these factors to come and seek refuge. So there's that part. But then at the same time, you have things like the temporary foreign worker program, where you actually select who you're willing to bring in on a temporary basis to do a very specific task that no one else can do and no one else is willing to do, right? Because it's so strenuous to do. So it's a selective form of, who goes in and who goes out in the interest of the most powerful, and leaving the vulnerable really often without any avenues. The majority of migrant workers, refugees, immigrants in general, will all tell you they would have much rather stayed in their own home countries if their own home economies, environments had not been so disrupted. They're much happier in their own countries. And so when we have the conversation on migration, we have to have it hand in hand with the role that countries like Canada play around the world in causing this disruption globally.
I think that's such an important point, that hand-in-hand piece of the conversation. We can't talk about migrant. I'm just going to repeat back because I think it's so important, is that we can't have those conversations around migrant policies here without, as well as talking at the same time, talking about this global picture. One of the things that Raul again talks about so articulately, and I want to get into from your report, is experiences, what people do experience when they come. And I know we've talked a little bit about how that many people experience it as a form of slavery. You've talked about some of the conditions that people face. I know you talk about gender-based violence in the report. Can you tell us more about what some of those experiences are, what we're really talking about when we're talking about the impact of these policies?
Yes, and I reread the report. Obviously, this ahead of our conversation is most shaken again by the findings and by the power of the voices of migrant workers. So we documented a range of violations. Which I would summarize as labor exploitation. And labor exploitation may sound a bit too abstract for some. And so again, I take you back to that word from the Special Rapporteur of contemporary forms of slavery. Some of the violations that we heard and documented were things like wage theft, for instance, or unfair deductions. What does this mean? It means that once people arrived in the country and started working with that one employer, remember the tied visa is extremely important, right? So, and perhaps let me start there. So you have your visa, but it is your permit indicates very clearly the name of the only employer that you are allowed to work with. Right. And employers often pay a sort of labor impact assessment and then work with recruiters to bring you in. So once you arrive as a migrant worker in the country, one of the first things that you may realize is that a lot of the expenses which should be taken care of by your employer are now being deducted from your own wages and your salary. So things like medical expenses, plane tickets, that got you here, transportation, things that legally should be paid by the employer are now being directly deducted from your wage, which means that you're working, but you're not earning a living, or you're earning much less, which again ties you to that worker. You need to continue in order to feel that. There's a sense of debt bondage as well. Often these workers will go into debt to be able to pay the recruitment fees to the recruitment agency. And once they arrive, they're stuck paying back that amount. And that gives the employer a sense of ownership over the migrant worker. The closest thing I can think is really a dowry. You know how in some countries, your spouse will pay a dowry to the bride's family, and then feels a sense of full entitlement and power over you because of that. So wage theft is a big one. Excessive working hours. We heard from workers who are working up to 80 hours a week and sometimes working days nonstop without a rest. We saw a range of extra tasks being asked of them, which were not included in their contract. So you were hired to be an agricultural worker and you end up clearing snow for your employer, you end up chopping wood, you're doing domestic work, you're cooking, you're mowing the lawn, you're cutting trees. We had one migrant worker who was asked by his employer to saw a tree without any training whatsoever in this. Then we documented unsafe working conditions. People asked to work without any protective equipment. So no masks, no gloves while you're handling agricultural produce that has been sprayed with chemicals that then has created some workers developing respiratory diseases. One very striking case of a migrant worker told us that he had to continue working with dead animals on the farm because his employer would not clear out the dead animals, and that was very close to where he was working. So things like that, not being given proper equipment to do their work. A number of them experienced serious injuries. We had a case of a migrant worker who had his who was asked to go into a drainage hole, and part of a wall collapsed on him, and he had his pelvis fractured, and the employer did not do a thing about that, just watch him. And it was another colleague who had to bring him to the hospital, and he ended up undergoing surgery. But besides that, he was not given proper care at all. The list goes on. Inadequate housing. We saw migrant workers in overcrowded, unsanitary housing conditions. We received photos of stained and dirty toilets, food cabinets, which were infested with cockroaches, and people expected to live in absolutely inadequate housing, sometimes no mattresses. And then there are the more, sort of emotional, so there's a range of physical conditions, but also emotional and psychological abuse, including racial abuse. Many of them experienced racial slurs, xenophobia, some of them being told, we will send you back to the tree you came from. I mean, things that were, and then obscenities that I cannot, repeat. You'd have to read that in the report. Some workers were made to sit on a chair in the winter for hours as a punishment for, taking a break that they are entitled to. And then there was gender-based violence as well, with many women and men being, being victims of sexual abuse by their employers repeatedly, sometimes for over a year. And again, workers not having like they have an avenue to either report, to flee, or to escape from these working conditions, because remember, they are in debt bondage. They have very little to no information about their rights. And again, there are systemic inequities that make it difficult for them to be protected. So it's a full umbrella and range of acute human rights violations that are ongoing, that are not necessarily widespread. So we're not saying that this is the case for every migrant worker, but it very much varies per employer, and that's precisely the issue.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be for every employer for those kinds of, as you say, acute human rights abuses to be a real and systemic problem. And I think that's one of the interesting things you draw out in the report is this, the abuses are happening by employers or by their agents, but the problems are systemic. And that's what we need to try to solve. And when I was thinking about it, I felt like there were perhaps three kind of buckets of systemic issues. One is the tied work permits, and thank you for walking us through that. Was going to be my next question for you. So thank you for that, and the ways in which that the tie-in there, and all the ways you've just said, creates this vulnerability, creates the conditions for exploitation, the stifling of complaints, the stifling of information about what people's rights are. The second bucket is the disproportionate impact of this program on certain racialized communities. And we haven't delved into that a lot at this point, but I understand 70% of people enrolled in this program are from Mexico, India, Philippines, Guatemala, and Jamaica, meaning that workers from those areas are disproportionately impacted by the kinds of abuses that you've just talked us through. And in addition, the high numbers of temporary farm workers, we've talked about the agricultural workers, significant population in this program, but also there's the caregivers who are working under this program, who are predominantly women. And the third bucket is that workers have little chance of securing more long-term immigration status here in Canada. What am I missing from that view? What else? What other systemic issues might I not be including there?
Yes, that's a great picture you're painting, Kasari. I would add to that the limited access to things like healthcare, just the infrastructure of care, the limited access to remedies, right? So the grievance process exists, but in practice, it's not accessible, and we can talk about that. Overall, I had something else in mind. It will come back to me. Yes, I would really just highlight the lack of infrastructure to support. And yes, the other one was the inspection system, right? So there is a responsibility on the government and the province to ensure that the working conditions are livable and are adequate. But we see a lot of issues when it comes to inspecting workplaces, where and it's a faulty system where very often these inspections are happening virtually rather than in person. Very often they are announced ahead of time, so employers have the time to clean up and clean house and send the extra workers away. And so we end up with inspections that are not reflecting the reality on the ground. And so again, that adds to the lack of, to difficulty in accessing remedies and a proper grievance process.
I did want to talk a bit about enforcement. So I appreciate those other buckets that you've added in there. There was a recent case in BC where the Employment Standards Act, I think it was January of this year, Employment Standards Act awarded $80,000 to 5 workers for various violations, including many of them that you've kind of touched on as systemic issues. Workers working 15 to 17 hours a day, underpayment of wages, some of the pieces around related to kind of the picture of indentured labor that you've painted for us. Workers, although this isn't part of the decision, the workers talked about the incredibly substandard housing that they experienced, the very, very dirty and unsanitary housing, the rat infestations that they faced. And all of that, the decision follows a Service Canada audit where this employer got a clean bill of health. So it's a great illustration of what you're talking about. So in your view, I mean, I think you've answered this for us, but can you tell us, I was going to ask, is Canada in compliance with its international legal obligations? But in your view, I think the answer to that is clearly yes. Can you tell us about some of the shifts that we need to make in order to bring us into, whether it's compliance with the law, or a better way to say it is to deal with these human rights violations? What are the fundamental shifts that need to happen?
Yes, and I think the answer is no. Canada is not compliant, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Sorry, did I say yes?
You said yes.
Sorry,
no,
I
I just want to
misspoke.
make it clear, and I'm
The
sure
answer
it's
is
clear for
no.
everyone.
Thank you for that.
I mean, what our conclusion, in the report is that this is not, as you rightly said, it's not an employer issue. It's not an exception. These are not exceptions. It's an inherently systemic issue that is really tied to the tied visa system. So our main overarching recommendation is to do away with to really reform and really remove the tied visa system, which creates this asymmetry of power and this entire dependence, and it creates too much in terms of power for the potential employer who would like to abuse those rights. So the onus is always on the state to ensure that there are no avenues to violate those rights. So that's our first and overarching recommendation and call, and that we all collectively have to work towards. And there is no reason why this continues. Now, in addition to that, there's a role that provinces also have to play, right, in ensuring that labor standards are equitably enjoyed by all, including migrant workers. And this varies from province to province. In British Columbia, I know that recruiters have to be registered with the province, but that's not always the case in every province. So we need a standard system across the board, and to ensure that again, labor rights, healthcare are provided to all. Very often, in the rare cases that migrant workers were able to walk through the various barriers and seek healthcare, seek access to remedy, seek inspections, and so on and so forth. They were met with provincial officials who thought that this did not apply to them because of their nature as migrant workers, and who thought this was a federal issue.
Right.
So there's a lot of education that needs to happen at the provincial level. There's a lot of awareness raising, but also of really enforcing to ensure that, these rights that other Canadians enjoy are also enjoyed by migrant workers. And then of course, there's the bigger piece around international law. There are covenants and treaties to which Canada has not acceded yet, including the International Convention on the Rights of All Migrants and Their Families, for instance, that Canada has not, acceded yet, or the optional protocol on the Convention Against Torture, OPCAT, and then a number of labor conventions as well that, like the Labor Inspection for Agriculture, the Occupational Safety and Health Convention, which need to be acceded to and then codified into domestic law to ensure, that these rights are protected. So there's work that is needed at the high level in terms of just legal level, ensuring that we are compliant, fully compliant, and we've codified these instruments into domestic law. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, for instance, not yet codified into domestic law. So there's that piece. There is the piece at there's simply the removal of the tied visa system that is imperative, and then there's a piece needed at a provincial level to ensure that migrant workers enjoy the rights that every other individual should enjoy.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the pieces I just want to draw attention to in that international law conversation is that we have signed on to some of the key pieces that actually, there's pieces we haven't signed on to, but there are pieces that we have signed on to that we are directly contravening the right to fair conditions of work in the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or rights for equality, substantive equality, and in all kinds of instruments, including Convention Against Racial Discrimination, for example. But one of the key pieces that you're pointing out there is that we haven't signed on to some of the pieces that would allow folks to have remedies under that, either domestically or internationally under the optional protocols. The 2019 program that introduced open visas for vulnerable workers did that go some way to addressing the problem? Maybe you can walk us through that a little bit, and then did that go some way to addressing the issues around tied visas that you've spoken to already?
The short answer is no, not enough. So in 2019, the program that you're referring to was introduced as an avenue for workers who had experienced human rights violations or who were in vulnerable situations, who were stuck with that one employer, to apply for an open permit. However, there are a lot of limitations with that. First of all, that permit is limited to 1 year and it's renewable, but under very limited circumstances. And when you as a worker apply for it, you are required to remain in the precarious situation you were in until you receive a positive decision. So imagine yourself a migrant worker with an employer who abuses you. You have to ensure that your work permit remains valid and that you are still in those conditions until you receive a positive answer. You also need to ensure that your work permit remains valid. And very often what happens, if you end up leaving that employer for an extended amount of time, obviously they will let you go, and therefore immediately your status will become, will become undocumented, because you are no longer supposed to be in the country if you're not working with that employer, right?
Yeah.
So it's unlikely that any migrant worker would go through that process. The information is very limited. People do not necessarily know how to go through that. It's a bureaucratic limbo very often, and you need a lot of support. You need the skills, the time, the means, because it is an application that you have to. There's a financial aspect to it, and the language skills to be able to navigate that very complex system. So I would say it's not designed with a vulnerable migrant worker in mind. It really isn't, and it's not an incentive for anyone who's in a desperate situation to reach out to and to access remedy. And then the other piece is that often it becomes stigmatizing, because once you've gone through that process or any grievance, then you're less likely to be employed by another employer because you're seen as a troublemaker. And so that limits your possibility of future employment, but it also hinders migrant workers from using it.
Yeah, that's a real portrait you painted in terms of the obstacles that are faced. So we've talked a lot about the problems and canvass some of what's in your report. What has the response been from federal, provincial, territorial governments to your report? Have they taken any steps as a result?
We haven't seen any sufficient, steps that would really mirror the magnitude of what we have reported, the magnitude of what the special rapporteur has reported. So it's and the magnitude of what, let's say this as well, migrant workers themselves have reported for years, and migrant workers organizations have reported for decades before we came forward with this report. So unfortunately, the changes are too piecemeal, they're too narrow, they're not systemic enough. And so we've seen changes, like, for instance, limiting workers to one sector rather than one employer, or, there was a commitment right after the special rapporteur's report came out, and our report from the previous Minister of Immigration, to limit the amount of temporary foreign workers. That does not change the issue. It's the conditions that must change, not the amount of people. And very clearly, what the numbers show us is that the program was designed for a temporary solution, but it's actually a temporary solution to a permanent problem. The number of temporary foreign workers has doubled since in the last 5 years, showing that there is a clear demand. There is a clear labor shortage and demand. And so the solution is not to reduce. The solution is simply to regulate it so that people are able to enjoy their lives and their human rights, and they're able to switch employers. So for us, the only truly systemic change would be to move from a tied permit to an open permit that enables people to choose their employers. And then that places greater scrutiny on the employers to ensure that they adhere by fundamental and basic human rights standards.
And so what's next? If we're at this point where you've seen only piecemeal change, as you've noted, these are not new calls to action, but this is an important inflection point to call for action. What's next in that advocacy for you?
What's next is that we have to, more of us have to do this work collectively together, raise our voices, bring these arguments forward. There's an education piece that is needed. We need to ensure that Canadians know about this. As I said earlier, I'm convinced that if people knew about this, they would demand this change. So the advocacy needs to become stronger, more collective, and louder. And we have to hold, including the new government, to account in more powerful ways. And so it's by making the issue visible. It's by doing what you're doing today, which is hosting a conversation. And hopefully there are folks on this call who did not know about this and now will be pushing for change in their own province, jurisdiction, area of work. This is how any change, any human rights advances were ever made in the history of the world. It was never by those who are, who have the ability to make change, waking up and deciding to, to remove those barriers. It has always been done by people who are, organizing, working together, not giving up, and who ultimately make that change possible. And so that's our task. I think that is our task today in Canada. And I'm so glad that we're doing this part of it together today.
Well, that's an incredibly powerful call to action. And I want to, on that note, invite folks. We've got some questions coming in through the Q&A. Please send us more. We wanted to start with one question from the audience, which is, do you think the Temporary Foreign Workers Program is a form of government sanctioned or legalized human trafficking, especially given there's no path to citizenship? Can you define how you understand human trafficking in this context? And then again, what can governments and advocates do? I can certainly say, hearing this and having this conversation makes me think. My family came from India to South Africa as indentured laborers, and then much later left under apartheid South Africa. And it certainly there's echoes of indentured labor here in some very significant ways. But Ketty, what do you think about this human trafficking comparison?
That's an interesting comparison, and I think it's not the conclusion we came to in the report. And what I find is that it's legitimate to think of it that way. But what I find is that sometimes we try to find a word that captures the enormity of what we're seeing in hope that it elicits a response. But what we have reported is already abhorrent, right? So akin to a form of slavery. It is, in this case, there are elements of it which wouldn't fall exactly under human trafficking, but when you look at the impact on the individuals, it is very much similar. The sense of not losing your agency completely, being under the power, the oversight of your trafficker, in this case, of your employer or the recruiting agency, not having access to remedies or to a grievance process. There are the emotional abuse. There are a lot of similarities, and they both need for us to be extremely, extremely engaged.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There's a few questions about kind of remedies or where people can go. One question is, when migrant workers die in Canada, is there any consistent place either of you know of where those deaths get reported?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't know the answer to that either, I'm afraid.
That's
Another here is, are there channels of reporting about the impact of Canadian large mining companies on environment, water source pollution in other countries? Any consequences for the companies? What are the responsibilities of Canadian-based private industry to protect environment and human rights?
That's a very interesting question, because we do work on this quite a bit. And I was reflecting to myself that the way in which the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is designed, placing the onus on the employer to treat the employees adequately, is similar to what happens in the mining and extractive industry, where the onus again is on the company. So there are no formal ways to hold Canadian companies accountable. There is what's called the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, but their role is, is not to prosecute, is not to compel, they can certainly investigate, but they do not have the power to compel, those who are violating those rights. And it's very much a sort of public education, program for corporations and mining companies who are asked and told, well, here's how you should behave. Please do behave this way, right?
Yeah.
And which is very similar when you think about it to the system with temporary foreign workers program, where again, the information is out there, employers know how they should treat people, but there are no enforcement mechanisms. And so the key issue is enforcement. And unfortunately, there isn't any strong system in terms of extractive industries right now. Canadian courts have started, there's been one case and they're building to prosecute cases brought forward by affected victims in other countries, but it's still very new, and we don't have a system in the country to do so. So much to do.
Yeah. I've got a couple questions here about the BC context that I'll take a stab at answering. So what role does our office, the Human Rights Commissioner, play in advocating for migrant workers? And that migrant workers are protected by the Human Rights Code, but there are major barriers to accessing those remedies. What are the barriers and what needs to change in order to ensure that barriers are removed so that migrant workers feel safe to access complaint remedies and response mechanisms? So I'll answer specifically in the context of BC, but you may have some ideas as well, Ketty, in terms of removing barriers. Certainly migrant workers are covered by the Human Rights Code, and it's one way that falls within the jurisdiction of my office, the Human Rights Commission. We don't work on federal issues. My mandate is specific to British Columbia. That said, so in terms of the significant issues that we've talked about today, in terms of the tied work permits and the structure of the program itself is outside of my jurisdiction. We're raising awareness about those issues in the context of conversations like this, the Dignidad video, and the Rights in Focus spotlight that I discussed earlier. But some ways in which there is BC more direct jurisdiction is in the context of the Human Rights Code, the application of employment standards, housing standards, WorkSafe remedies in that context. And again, we saw some success that migrant workers were seeing at the employment standards in the employment standards context, that case that I referenced earlier. Our job is not to, which may be clear for the questioner, but just to be clear to the audience, is not to resolve individual complaints, but to do the systemic advocacy. I think one of the very significant obstacles facing anybody trying to seek remedies through our provincial human rights system is a significant lack of resources. The tribunal is massively under-resourced to be able to deal with the backlog from the pandemic, but also the steady increase and steady and dramatic increase of complaints over the last number of years. They weren't able to keep up before that. They weren't resourced enough to keep up with it before. They definitely aren't to keep up with the delay, with the backlog now. So resourcing is a very significant piece of the puzzle in terms of allowing for individual complaints to be effectively resolved. But there's also the systemic change. So for example, pushing government to end the wait period for MSP eligibility for people coming from with under programs like this. So for migrants, which we have been doing and joining others in community to do, although not seeing a great deal of success. Ketty, do you want to speak at all to obstacles people face in those individual complaint mechanisms?
Yes, really briefly, and I'll quote actually a recommendation from the special rapporteur, and he recommended creating a single coordination body, which would have full oversight of migrant workers' rights and their conditions, to ensure that the federal, provincial, and territorial and municipal, actors were all engaged, because very often what migrant workers will face is what's called I'm going to have trouble saying the word interjurisdictional neglect, meaning that you are confronted with such a range of different jurisdictions. So you've talked about the provincial level, but territorial, federal, that it is again a judicial limbo for people to really access remedy. So I thought that his recommendation was really interesting, which would be to streamline all these into one spot and a single point of contact for migrant workers who are at risk, to be able to, to report, to access remedy, but to also report all types of abuses, beyond the health safety, but including labor, including healthcare, and so on and so forth. So in other words, we have to design a system that makes it easy for these people who are in these abject and vulnerable conditions to seek remedy, and go beyond, trying to having each body work out a system. We have to build a comprehensive and one point system that makes it possible for people to overcome those obstacles. And we're not there yet, but we need to work towards that.
Absolutely. I did want to add, we had a comment here from one of the audience members who says, in BC, WorkSafe BC does document fatalities related to work accidents. Unfortunately, as it is with many provincial and federal agencies, there's no distinction between regular workers and temporary foreign workers with closed permits when it comes to enforcing regulations. So that's just an answer, a further answer to the question about recording recording of deaths. Another question here is, do migrant workers have any leeway to negotiate the terms of their employment contracts when they arrive under the TFWP or the SAWP? Or are the terms more or less forced upon them?
Yes, so the answer is no. Very often the terms are already set. And not only are the terms set, the terms often change when they arrive here. So not only are they not able to negotiate, very often they find that they are working in completely different conditions. We have a case of a woman from Cameroon who had come to work to Canada, being promised, a well-paying and regular wage job, and then discovered she was going to work on a poultry farm, which she had absolutely no idea about, with nearly no rest, in working conditions that were unsafe, and where she was regularly again abused. So no. There's very limited space and avenue for them for these conditions to be altered, to be changed. And again, because once you're here, you're tied to that one employer, you're really at the mercy of that employer.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the successes that have happened with the advocacy in this area? Can you point us to give us some hope about the changes that have been made?
Mm-hmm. I think this is becoming, I think that a few years ago, this was a completely invisible issue, completely. People had no idea about it, had no sense of what a migrant worker was or what they experienced, and couldn't speak to any of the challenges that they faced. I think that today that has begun to shift. The level of awareness is beginning to increase. We've seen the media reporting various cases. We are hearing more and more that migrant workers are experiencing, human rights abuses, violations, and perhaps for the ordinary, citizen who's not deep into these issues, that may be it. That may be as much as they know. But there is a level of awareness that has increased. And that is helpful because elected officials, of course, respond to demands from their electorate. And so the more, and I think this is where the hope is, the more there'll be, sort of pushes, demands from people, the more decision makers themselves are aware. I've met decision makers who were, including members of parliament, who were completely unaware of this issue, who had no idea about the various loopholes and the various challenges a migrant worker had in order to access remedy, or the challenges of the tied visa system. So I think we're making progress in in that awareness raising. And our experience has been, as an organization that not only researches, documents, but advocates and campaigns for human rights, our experience is that the more that awareness grows and the more we campaign for it, the more change is likely to happen, as it did in the case of immigration detention, which again was a situation that was largely unknown by the majority of Canadians. But today we are at a stage where every province in the country has cancelled their immigration detention contracts with CBSA, British Columbia being the first, and your own report being helpful to make that happen. But we see that, change is a compounded effect. It's multi-layered, and it starts always with rights holders being unheard. Slowly, local groups, organizations support, larger organizations come on board, government and other larger advocates come on board, and then together we create the momentum for that to shift. And so I think we're at a very good point now, and we need to carry on and continue and push through until this change, which is very possible, actually happens. So I am hopeful that with everyone who is on the call today and the range of advocacy we're doing, that we will get there and that we'll come back and have this conversation, and things will have changed.
I look forward to that. Absolutely. Another question here from the audience. Would increased pre-settlement services prior to arrival in Canada help to address the issues that workers face? Are workers currently unaware of their rights?
So yes, they're often unaware of their rights, and when they arrive, they clearly realize that their rights are violated, but they often do not know how to go about seeking remedy for those human rights violations. So there's been an increase, and I think that's an area in which the government has made some improvement in ensuring that people are aware of their rights and how they can go about seeking remedy. But first, this is often too removed. So often information is available on a website, for instance, when the migrant worker who's in a rural area with very limited access to internet, or limited also by the employer, is not likely to go through all these various websites. So we have to make the information much more directly available. But again, the onus should not be on the migrant worker and the rights holder to fight for the rights that they should enjoy, which is why all of these are, again, really piecemeal approaches to the fundamental shift that needs to happen, and which is that an equal relationship between the employer and the employee, which is why for us, we go back to that fundamental root cause, the tied visa. It doesn't matter how much information becomes available to people. If the tied visa system continues to exist, people will fall into the trap. They will get into it, and employers then will continue to abuse workers because they can.
And as I understand it, there are no pre-arrival settlement services available to them.
No, they are not. They're not. This is not a case of like a resettlement of a refugee, for instance. They do not get to enjoy those services, including as well the healthcare services that are available to others. So no.
What are some of the pieces on healthcare? We know that that we need to address the waiting periods on MSP. Are there other aspects of healthcare, other solutions to ensuring access to adequate healthcare?
Yes. So at the moment, often healthcare is provided through a private insurance by the employer. For which again, if you're an employer who's not compliant, you're bound to do so, but you're not held accountable to do so. So migrant workers do not have automatic access to healthcare. and rely very much on their employer to access it. And again, that varies also per province as well. So we've had cases, we saw cases of people who were ill and were told to simply take, some Advil and they'll get better. And they had, severe infections. And again, the employer did not have, despite the obligation, did not go through and provide them with that healthcare. Or we have cases where when the employer does indeed provide those access to healthcare, it is deducted from the wage of the worker. So ensuring that healthcare is provided to all is absolutely fundamental.
Last question for you before we begin to wrap up, which is a question from the audience about what advice do you have to advocates and self-advocates working in this area?
Oh, my advice is to remember that change is possible. Often when you're faced with such a huge, daunting case like this one, it may feel like, we're not making progress, but it is to know and believe that change is possible and, to continue to push as much as you can, to listen directly to migrant workers and their experiences, because they will haunt you. Every time I pick a strawberry and cut my strawberry at home, I am thinking of, a woman who we documented in our report and who was mistreated or whose rights were violated. And then it compels me to do more, to stretch a little bit further and do that work. So it's really about taking injustice personally, believing that change is possible, and working collectively. We're only going to overcome this if we work together. It's going to require a wide range of folks from a wide range of expertise and sectors coming together and really calling and pushing for this change. It should not be on migrant workers to carry this burden of pushing for change while they also undergo these violations. It is on us advocates to do so.
Thank you for that. And I would add that I think the note of hope that you brought earlier about how change has happened in the world, this issue and beyond, and the advocacy that does come, sort of that groundswell, is what will make the difference. It's often we all feel like we are beating our head against the wall when we're part of that groundswell, but it is indeed the only thing that will make that difference and bring that hope to all of us. Ketty, thank you so much for being here with us, sharing your wealth of knowledge, being the conduit by which we heard about many of the experiences of migrant workers in these situations. Thank you again to Dignidad Migrante, who for the video to build our knowledge, and to Raul in particular. We've provided some resources in the chat for folks looking for some of the sources that we've talked about today. I did want to thank everyone, of course, for making the time to be here. We will be making this recording available on YouTube and our website shortly. You will be directed shortly to a survey that we'd be really grateful for your feedback on. We will continue to do this behind the scenes, or behind the headlines rather, series, and your feedback makes a huge difference. Ketty, is there anything you wanted to say in closing to our audience today?
Oh, thank you so much. The last reflection I'd like to share is that the history, when you look back at the history of racism, including slavery around the world, it was always rooted in exploitation of land and exploitation of labor. The ability to gain cheap labor. That's what slavery was about ultimately, right? It's the ability to secure cheap labor, dispensable labor. And so we need to think about this issue along those lines, right? So this is our battle today for our times. And I just want to encourage everyone who's joining us today to really take that on, to personally take that on and pursue it and continue. And I want to thank migrant workers who trusted us with their stories, despite the, of course, the violations they underwent. All our teams, your team as well, who made this possible, and all the advocates who continue despite the odds. Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here with you. And yes, I look forward to us bringing more change forward in the months, years to come.
As do I. Thank you, everyone. Take good care.